So now we move on to our next speaker, Dr. Marilyn Huestis. One of the most significant issues in the discussion of marijuana use is the safety of our roadways. As District Attorney Jeff Rosen, as well as Supervisor Cindy Chavez mentioned in their earlier comments, this is an ongoing issue in our state. Earlier this year, DA Rosen and Assemblyman Evan Lowe from our area here in Santa Clara County sponsored AB 2740, a driving under the influence of marijuana bill. In March of this year, Dr. Marilyn Huestis was invited to come to Sacramento at our invitation and testify before the Assembly Public Safety Committee in Sacramento and provide her valuable research to educate legislators. Not only did she educate the legislators by going to the committee, answering some tough questions, but she also did a meet and greet with several members of the committee and talked to them and share her research. And she was very persuasive. This was critical in getting the bill through the Public Safety Committee. Dr. Huestis is an internationally renowned expert, just returned from Australia where she presented much of her work, and we are grateful to have her. She'll be leaving this afternoon, flying to Chicago to present at a conference there. So we're very fortunate that she was able to fit us into her busy schedule. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Marilyn Huestis.
Good morning. I am really happy to be here. I think this is an important outreach to the public and discussion in an open forum about this topic. I've spent most of my life researching cannabis, both before and for the last 23 years at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, where I just retired in January. And I believe that the role of the scientist is to take your research and communicate it to the public and make it available for people to make their own informed decisions. I also believe in evidence-based drug policy, and so this research, I think, sheds a lot of light on the topic of cannabis. So first of all, the reason we're all here is obviously because of the huge increase. More than half of our states now have medical marijuana laws, and as you're well aware, 4 states have legalized it. So it's a topic that is relevant to absolutely all of us. So cannabis has been used for more than 4,000 years. They've actually found evidence in mummies of young women going through childbirth where they use cannabis to help reduce the pain. But now we have more, and you saw this in one of the previous speaker's slides. In 2009, for the first time, more young people are smoking cannabis than tobacco. That's a huge change in the prevalence of use. And 6%, almost 6% of seniors in high school are smoking it daily, just at the time point when they're trying to learn and they're in school and they're making decisions about their future. In the large increase in cannabis dependence admissions to treatment that we've seen, 86.8% of those individuals started using cannabis before the age of 17. Now, we were all waiting. The Drug Enforcement Agency had stated that they were going to, as they do every year, look at the legalization of cannabis and the scheduling. And it was just announced a couple of weeks ago that the Delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC as I will call it the rest of today, is going to remain a Schedule I substance. They did make a change in that more than one location will be able to grow the cannabis to produce it, so it'll be available for especially clinical trials. So I like to think that we're in the middle of the great cannabis experiment. And this experiment is going to play out over the next several decades. In Uruguay, and I was recently in Uruguay, they're the first country in the world to make cannabis use legal completely. As you're very much aware, the Canadian Prime Minister that was recently elected, Prime Minister Trudeau, has made cannabis legalization part of their program, and I'm actually going on September 28th. The Canadian government is having a meeting similar to this, looking at how are we going to control the many issues about cannabis, whether it be driving, how do we keep it out of our children's hands, etc. So everybody is wrestling with this now. And decriminalization is very common in many countries. So there are some advantages to this approach. One, it'll make it easier to conduct research. I've been doing this research. It is hard. It took me as long as 4 years to get one clinical study approved through the Ethics Committee review, the Food and Drug Administration review, the Drug Enforcement Agency approvals. So it's difficult. And we do have some potential benefits for cannabinoids, not just THC, but other cannabinoids that are present in the cannabis plant. So it'll make research a little bit easier. It'll make it a little bit easier for patients to get medications. In the reduction on the criminal justice system, I think the biggest issue is you hear all the time about, well, it's going to reduce and going to release many people who are in jail just for possession of cannabis. In general, that's not true. If you look at the cases, it involves other crimes like breaking and entering or some other crime as well. And it might lead to improvement of the cannabis products. You know that in Colorado, some people are actually suing the government because of the pesticides that might be present in those. So if we could get products that were safer for individuals, that'd be a positive thing too. But there are a lot of issues we need to think about as we are doing here today and tomorrow. So what are the short and the long-term consequences of the approach? So we know the decreased perception of risk. I talk to people all the time. I have parents say to me, I am so glad my kid is not drinking alcohol and driving. They're just smoking cannabis and driving. They obviously are not informed about the effects of cannabis on driving. And kids will say to you, well, if it's a medicine, how can it be bad for me, right? If people are legalizing it and they're using it as medicine, how can it be bad for me? We have major issues already with increased dependence, and we don't, as you know, we don't have a good medicine that helps us with cannabis dependence like we do with opioid dependence. We have good behavioral treatment programs, but we don't yet have a pharmacotherapy that would help. The biggest long-term issue is that we know, we have lots of scientific evidence that cannabinoids affect the developing brain. And we don't have any idea what the long-term effects are going to be on the endogenous cannabinoid system. So I say that you need to know that we have a very important system in all of our brains and bodies that is called the endogenous cannabinoid system. And it was not put there or developed so that people could smoke cannabis and get high. It is a critical system in our bodies that help with temperature control, hunger control, basic survival things, memory, reproductive hormones. So we have this naturally in our system, and it's critical for our life. And yet, when people smoke cannabis, they basically hijack that system. I'm going to show you a lot about that now. Oops. Am I not moving this one? Oh, I'm bad. Sorry. Oh. Okay, so I'm the one who said we needed 2 computers. You needed to tell me. Okay, so hopefully you understood that. Now I'll remember both two buttons. So this is the human brain, and what's really important for you to know is that the cannabis affects all of these areas. So if you can see the amygdala, and I only have one pointer, but the amygdala is right here. This is why people use cannabis. So the amygdala is the center of your emotions. Okay, it's the euphoria that people get, the relaxation that they get. That's why people use it. And the reason it works is because there are many cannabinoid receptors. You know, the way things work is we have receptors, and then we take different chemicals or drugs, they bind to those receptors and they cause effects. So when people smoke cannabis, the THC binds to these receptors in the amygdala, and they give them the positive response they want. But look here, so in the basal ganglia, right here, and in the cerebellum down here, these are the major areas that are controlled with not only movement, motor control, but planning motor control. And these two areas are loaded with CB1 cannabinoid receptors. So the person takes the THC, they bind to the receptors in these areas, and they affect your motor control, your ability to plan your actions. Another very important reason, the hypothalamus, right here. The hypothalamus is in the area where we have lots of control over our appetite, our different hormones, different reproductive factors, and they also are affected. But probably the most obvious area too is in the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is here, and the hippocampus is in charge of memory. So one of the most robust effects about cannabis is reduction in short-term memory, and that's why that's so involved. Now, the other thing that's important is this is the brainstem down here, and the brainstem contains very few cannabinoid receptors. So this is why people don't die from overdoses of smoking cannabis, because the brainstem is involved with our respiration and our cardiovascular effects, and there are very few receptors that bind to THC there. I have never seen a cannabis death that came from an overdose of smoking marijuana, okay? They can go out and they can die on the highway because they're impaired driving. They can have hallucinations, they can fly and jump off a building. And the newer, we don't have time to talk about that today, but the newer synthetic cannabinoids that you hear so much about are up to 40 or more times as potent as THC or cannabis. And people can die and have died from taking those synthetic cannabinoids. But the big difference between us and lower mammals is our huge cortex. This area of the brain is much more developed in people than in animals, and it is packed with cannabinoid receptors. In fact, the largest group, the highest density of receptors in the cortex of the G protein receptors are cannabinoid receptors. And what does that big cortex do for us? The difference is that we can take in all kinds of information from our environment, our senses. You know, we hear things, we smell things. We take it in, and then we evaluate it. And we decide, what does this mean to me? Is it important? Is it not important? Do I need to react to this? I make decisions. I think I access my memory. What should I do in this situation? And this is also the area we call executive function. We call it divided attention. It enables us to do so many things at one time. And this is the area where cannabinoids have their greatest effect. We have the huge number of receptors, and it affects our executive function, our decision making. One of the best examples that I want to tell you about a cannabis accident, this is a true story. A teenager's driving down a small town road. He's got his friends in the car. They're smoking marijuana. They've been smoking. They look down and he sees an old man crossing the street. And, you know, we never know what our brain is doing. You know, it's always working in the background. And he's calculating the speed with which the man is crossing the street, the speed with which he's driving, and he decides, no problem. He's going to be out of the way before I get there. But the old man drops his keys. And he's older, and he has a hard time bending over and getting those keys, and he's fumbling. The teenager sees it, and he recognizes it, but the time that it takes him to process, uh-oh, he slowed down, uh-oh, what should I do? Should I turn to the left? Should I slam on the brakes? He's doing all of that, but your reaction time, your ability to make decisions is slowed, and he runs the guy over. No intention to do it, no wanting to do it, but that's one of the ways in which the brain is affected by cannabis. Okay, now I gotta do two things at once. Okay, so we're going to talk first, I think one of the most important short-term consequences of cannabis legalization is the effect on driving. Okay, so Olaf Drummer from Australia, where I just returned, and I've still got the 15-hour time difference thing going, he was the first one who was able to collect enough cases, motor vehicle fatalities, in Australia to be able to prove that THC significantly increased the risk of a fatal accident, a crash. So think about this. Most times people aren't just using THC. In fact, the most common use is a little bit of alcohol and a little bit of cannabis. So when you're going to determine whether a drug is causing or increasing fatal accidents, you have to have cases that only have that one drug. Because if there are multiple drugs on board, and we all know that this is the era of polypharmacy, so people are using cannabinoids and opiates and amphetamines and opiates, if you're going to do it, you have to have enough cases that are just THC alone. So he collected 3,400 deaths in Australia on the roads, and he was able to show that if there was any measurable THC in the blood, and their limit of quantification was 1, so that really means if you have THC in the blood of 1 nanogram per mil or higher, you had a 2.8% increase. You had 2.8 increase in the odds ratio of having a fatal accident. And if the concentration went up to 5, the odds ratio was increased by 6.8. And this was similar to what they saw with an alcohol of 0.1 to 0.15. Okay, so the big wake-up call in the United States happened with the report in 2007 that the Office of National Drug Control and Policy asked the NHTSA, which is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They said, look, every 10 years you look to see the effect of alcohol on driving. We need to look and see what the effect of drugs are on driving. So for the very first time in 2007, they took blood and oral fluid. Oral fluid is saliva in your mouth, and they looked for drugs. And it was shocking, because even though those of us who are forensic toxicologists who know about the number of people that are dying dying and end up in medical examiners and coroners, we knew that cannabis was really increasing. This was the first objective evidence, and it was shocking. 8.6% of weekend nighttime drivers were positive for cannabinoids in their blood or oral fluid. Now, does this mean they're all impaired? No. Okay, it's talking about prevalence. So when this concern came out, we're way behind Australia. They started testing for drugs in saliva at the roadside with random stops in 2004. In Europe, they started doing this again about a couple of years later. Everybody's been concerned about drug-impaired driving, and this was the wake-up call we needed. So again, now ONDCP said, we're not waiting 10 years. Let's go back and see what's happening again, because this is a major issue. In just 6 years, the incidence of cannabis in blood or oral fluid increased 48% in just 6 years to 12.6% of weekend nighttime drivers. We already know that cannabis is the #1 drug after alcohol. Alcohol is still #1, but the #1 illicit drug in U.S. fatal drug cases and major injuries. Now, some other data, epidemiological data, Just to show you, I want you to keep thinking, Olaf Drummer found 2.8 times the odds ratio. Here is a recent study from 2012 that looked, you could almost see it if I move it there. Oops, sorry. There we go. They found that 2.66 was the overall crash risk increase in their studies. Another one came out in 2012, different marijuana studies showing an increased odds ratio for a major injury of 1.92. And that basically, if you look at all the data, you'll see about a doubling of the risk. Alcohol can be much higher. The higher the concentration of alcohol, the greater the crash risk is. And people say, well, gee, it's just doubled. Doubled is really important. You're doubling your risk of being involved in a major crash or fatal accident. Let's see what's happening in Washington State. Fiona Cooper is the chief toxicologist in Washington State, and they looked at the changes that are occurring in the prevalence of cannabis use. And they found when they had medical cannabis improved, that the number of cases that were involved in their accidents was 19.1% in 2009. At medical cannabis, when they legalized it, it increased to just about 1/4 of all their impaired driving cases involved cannabis. And now that they've had legalization for a few years, more than 30% of their driving under the influence of drug cases are cannabis related. Now, I don't want to tell you that all the data agree. The epidemiological data are mixed. The Druid study that was carried out in the European Union, a very good study, had tremendous variability across different countries. So they had 13 countries involved. Some showed a huge increase in risk, others showed no increase in risk. But what they did find in all the data was an increase. 1.9 is the increase for being responsible for a fatal car crash. NHTSA, again the same organization, NHTSA carried out a drug and alcohol crash study in Virginia Beach, Virginia. The preliminary results are out, and when they took into account things like male, young, they found no increase in the odds ratio for a crash. They put some limitations that they said about this study. It was only run in one city, Virginia Beach, Virginia. I'm a military child and a military wife. I can tell you that Virginia Beach, Virginia is very, very high in medical personnel who are constantly tested, drug tested randomly in the military. And they feel that perhaps this affected those results. They're carrying out another study because most of these accidents were very minor. They're carrying out another study currently that is looking at major injuries and major fatalities. So I am really excited because my friends at the Office of National Drug Control Policy, I bugged them, I complained bitterly that the United States built this wonderful world's most advanced driving simulator, and you see it here, it's in, you don't see it there, you don't see it there. It's inside the size of an aircraft hangar. It's huge. There's this large globe, and inside that globe it has huge actuators. It goes very, very fast in all directions, and there's a full car inside, and the person that is being tested has no idea they're up in the air. We have a closed area, so they walk in and they think they're just getting into a car. But this is so sophisticated that it can move fast like the, when you accelerate in your car, if you slam on your brakes, it will, you'll feel that thrust as it's changing. So it's a very, very advanced simulator. It's never been used to test an illicit drug. So I complained for about 10 years And finally, they turned around to me and said, here's the money, just go do it. So I got to do it, which was really fantastic. And in fact, it hadn't been even used to test alcohol until about 3 or 4 years ago. Okay, so here it is. And you can see the full car inside. You can see that it's 360 degrees around you. So you see the car lights coming towards you, the white lights. You see them go by you, and then you see the tail lights as they disappear. We go over some gravel. In some cases, you can see here, you can see my eyes. We have cameras on the eyes so we can see how well you're checking your peripheral vision, because one of the things that cannabis does is narrow your vision, a little tunnel vision. So when the kid comes out on a bicycle unexpectedly into the roadway, one of the first problems is you don't see them as quickly that they're coming, and then you have all the executive function issues as well. So we can check all of those items, and if we go to the study, you'll see we had both an urban city portion, we had the getting onto the freeway and trucks passing and all the things that happen on the highway, and then we have a really long rural section. And in the rural section, they're driving on gravel. And this is so realistic that as you're driving, not only do you feel the bumps of the gravel, you actually hear the kind of crunch, crunch, crunch. So when you're in it, I've driven it, and when you're in it, you quickly lose the fact that you're not really actually driving. I have to tell you a funny thing. You see right here, this is the urban section, and we had to develop the first drive that would be sensitive to the effects of cannabis. And so we know about that executive function and divided attention. So we have deer jumping on the roadway, we have people opening their car doors into traffic, those kinds of things. But what was so funny, we started it out by saying, okay, your instructions are you drive down the main street, you see the Shell gas station, you turn left. So we did it, we piloted this with our first volunteers, and everybody high on marijuana drove right by the Shell station. So we actually had to change the drive to accommodate that. Okay, so what was really important about this study, and why we got great support from ONDCP, also from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, is that we made a decision to spend the money to do a really good study and to look at different potencies of cannabis and to look at them with and without low-dose alcohol. So we dose the alcohol up to about 0.05%. You know, in the United States, it's 0.08%. I want you to know how high that is. In most of the world, it's 0.05, and in the countries of Sweden and Finland and the Scandinavian countries, it's 0.02. And when I go there, which I go there a lot, we all drive to the restaurant, we have a great dinner and drink wine, and nobody drives home. Everybody takes taxis home. So one of the challenges, it's really hard to run a study 1,000 miles away. I like it when I can control everything, but this was 1,000 miles away, and one of the problems was the University of Iowa allows no smoking on the entire campus. And so we had to administer by the volcano vaporizer, which is how many both medical users use it as well as recreational. In fact, I was talking to my neighbors who are always interested in my research, and I said, gosh, you know, I can't even let them smoke cannabis. I have to get this device. They said, oh, we have one. It works really well. No problem. So I'm going to tell you quickly some of the most incredible data that have come out of this study. So the first thing that I want to tell you is that when you combine alcohol and cannabis, you significantly delay the peak of the alcohol. Okay? So the peak of the alcohol is moved a little bit later. later. And this is important because a lot of people think about, well, if, I'm gonna have a couple drinks and then I'm gonna wait 2 or 3 hours and then I'm gonna go. And when we think about that, was trying to reason what would cause that. Well, we know that cannabis causes the capillaries in your blood vessels to dilate. And we think the reason this happened is, what THC does is it causes a delay in emptying from your stomach to your intestine. Okay, it's called gastric emptying. And when people use marijuana, it reduces that. So you think about it, alcohol is primarily absorbed in the intestine, not in the stomach. And so the fact that they're smoking cannabis, they're going to delay the absorption of that alcohol, and the peak will come a little bit later. The second really critical outcome was that we found that when you mix alcohol and tobacco and cannabis together, that the alcohol caused a significantly greater peak concentration of THC. And that is very important. It helps explain the interaction between those two drugs. And why do we think that happens is because alcohol causes the capillaries to actually expand and allow things to be absorbed better. And that's why we think we had this finding. The next thing that we found, okay, is I'm going to talk about the effects on lateral control. Okay, so, whoops, you don't do that. Okay, so what lateral control is weaving within your lane. So it's the ability to keep your car within the lane. And we know that cannabis can affect that. Okay, and so what we were able to do, I'm reducing all this to very short slides, but what I want you to see for the first time in the same people, we have what alcohol alone does, what cannabis alone does, and what happens when they're then together. And so for the first time we could tell you within the same people what impairment level of THC was equal to a 0.05 alcohol or a 0.08 alcohol. And so this is really important, and I did many, many press interviews about this paper. And what we said is that a THC level in the blood of 8.2 impairs your driving, your lateral control, to the same degree that a 0.05 alcohol does. And in the same way, a THC level of 13 in the blood impairs similar to a 0.08 alcohol. And then I said the most important thing, this is at the time of driving, okay? At the time of driving. Well, if you don't know what the pharmacokinetics of THC look like, when you start to smoke a cannabis cigarette, the THC increases just dramatically. Huge increase to a great peak. And right away, it peaks before you stop smoking. Okay, the peak always occurs before the end of smoking. Why? Because people titrate their dose, and then it drops dramatically. Why does that happen? Because THC is lipophilic. It loves the fat. It's not like ethanol or alcohol that's very hydrophilic or likes the water. And so THC in the blood gets pulled out immediately by all the tissues, including the brain. So you think about it, you smoke, it goes right into your lungs, it goes right to the heart, and directly to the brain. And we know the speed of delivery of the drug to the brain is completely related to the abuse liability of that drug. So the people get the drug right in, and it goes right to the brain, and it gets pulled out by all the tissues around the body, including the brain. And the brain is a fatty tissue, right? All the myelin in our brain is very lipophilic. So the tissue holds that THC. So what really upset me is the reaction was, oh my gosh, you mean to tell me that you have to have 8 or 13 nanograms per mil of THC to be impairing? No, that's what's impairing the same degree of alcohol at the time of driving. Look at this. Luckily, we continue to measure the THC over time. Do you realize that within 30 minutes after the end of the smoking, that the THC concentration has dropped about 73–74%? Within 30 minutes. The average time that the blood is drawn by police after a stop or an accident is 1.4 to 3 hours after the event. In the United States, the average is 1.4 to 3 hours. I just was in Australia. They were absolutely shocked at this because their rule is you've got to draw the blood within 3 hours. So, if you wait 1.4 hours, which is the short end of the time, you've reduced the THC concentration by 90 to 91%. So we have a terrible problem because it takes time to get that blood drawn, which is why we're trying to use oral fluid at the roadside where individuals can police can take a sample right at the roadside and screen it. It's why we're trying for other devices that can identify drug use at the roadside. It's why we're trying to develop behavioral tests that will reliably identify drug use at the roadside. Because this is how quickly the THC in blood is decreasing. We're very happy we've gotten the International Association of Chiefs of Police to move collection of blood, recommend moving collection of blood as the last thing on the drug recognition experts' long examination to the first thing. Because you need to get the blood rapidly collected. And by the way, don't ever try to back calculate off of our formulas. This paper is available and will help people, but you can't back calculate at all because it's a very different animal than ethanol. Okay, let's talk about longitudinal control. Come on, longitudinal control. Ooh, here we go. All right, so longitudinal control is that distance, the speed within your lane, the variability of speed within your lane, and also the distance you keep to the car in front of you. Okay, so we even help them out more, is we give them a headway display, and when they're driving, we tell them keep the arrow in the green zone. So they know that they're supposed to keep a certain distance from the individual in front of them. And here are the results from the longitudinal control. So the first thing is if you look at the THC, THC will reduce the average speed of the driver. It will increase the percent of time that they are below the speed limit by 10%, and it will increase the following distance, okay? So individuals who are using cannabis tend to have some idea that they might be impaired, the opposite of alcohol, where they never think they're impaired. So if you look at alcohol, it's the opposite. They have an increase in the variability of their speed, and they have an increase in the time that they spend over the speed limit. And we have a significant interaction between the two. Catch up here. Okay, so if we look first at THC, I'm sorry I only have one way to point, but if you look here, as the THC alone increases, you'll see the speed also decreases. And if we look over here at the following distance, you'll see as the THC concentration increases, the following distance also increases. If we look at alcohol, we have the opposite issue. As the alcohol concentration increases, then we see an increase in speed. And if we look at the interaction between the two, you can see that now we have increasing THC and we hold the alcohol constant, as we did in the study. And you'll see initially that they may speed when the THC is low, and then eventually if the THC is higher, it will start to affect the speed and reduce it. But again, I want you to think about this, how quickly the THC comes out of the blood. So they get really high concentrations immediately, and then within a short period of time, 30 minutes, over 75% of that drug is gone. So the THC content, the THC effect on alcohol will be very short. Only when they're first smoking might it slow them down. As soon as it's out of the blood and into the tissues in the brain, the alcohol will be the driving aspect. Okay, so now I used to have a lot of friendly toxicologists, and when we did this work, it was a real shock, because even my own work studying acute cannabis use, we had shown that in occasional cannabis users, and our definition of an occasional cannabis user is that they use less than daily. So they could use 5 times a week, 6 times a week. We still say they were an occasional cannabis user. That the occasional cannabis user has THC out of their blood by about 6 to 8 hours. But we never had figured out, how do you study this critical population that is using large amounts of cannabis for a very long period of time. And I finally figured it out, and this is because all the research we do from a safety and an ethical point of view, we're never going to give people as much drug as they give themselves, okay, for safety and ethical and honestly financial reasons too. Because it costs more than $5,000 to be on our research unit for 1 day, and that doesn't include the doctors, the pharmacists, the nurses, any of it, just to have them in the closed research environment. So when we looked at this population, I took the heaviest, most chronic cannabis users. On average, they smoke 10 joints or blunts a day for more than 10 years, okay? This is not a really small part of our population, believe me. But what we found was really surprising. I could measure THC, this is the middle, this is carboxy-THC, not psychoactive, this is 11-hydroxy-THC, equally potent, equally psychoactive. But here's the THC. In 2 people, I could still measure THC 30 days after last use. They're on a closed research unit, no access to drug, at very low concentrations, not 5 or even 1. I'll show you those data. Well, this really threw a big problem into the driving under the influence of drugs. We had no idea that the THC was present in people's body that long. And you realize, what did I tell you? The THC is fat soluble. So when you smoke a lot every day, you build up a huge body burden of the drug in your system. Huge amounts. Think of all the fat deposits. Think about the brain that's so lipophilic. And so what happens when you stop using the drug, it slowly leaches out and goes into the blood and then gets excreted out of your body. So let's see what the repercussions of that are. Okay, so I told you this, how long we could measure it. Okay, so we had a very, very lucky opportunity. At the National Institutes of Mental Health, they were developing a ligand, a substance that would bind to those cannabinoid receptors I told you about. And they weren't looking for that, they were looking for something else, but they realized what they found. They knew about all of our cannabis research, and they said, let's do a study. And so for the first time, very objectively, we could look at the binding of these compounds to cannabinoid receptors, and what happens to these cannabinoid receptors in individuals who are doing all this smoking. So we had 28 subjects who had used less than 10 times in their life, and not over the last year, and we had 30 cannabis smokers, and you can see here that they reported that they had been smoking for 12 years, and that they had been smoking on average 10 joints per year. And we have beautiful objective data. The way to look at this, the black bars are the normal controls, and the green bars are the chronic frequent cannabis smokers, and these are all different areas of the brain. So you have the anterior cingulate cortex and the amygdala and the caudate and the hippocampus and so on. So we could determine the density of receptors in all these critical brain areas. In every place you see a star, we showed a significant downregulation or reduction in the cannabinoid receptors in the brain. That means your endogenous cannabinoid system is not working as it should be. And when you stimulate the receptors in your brain tries to recover, and so it reduces the number of receptors so that you can't overstimulate. And so this is objective evidence that individuals have their brain changed by chronic frequent cannabis use. So notice I had 30 smokers in this case, and now 28 days later, because these individuals came to us, I kept them overnight, so I knew that they could not be acutely intoxicated. We took them down and did the brain scans, and then I made them sit on the closed research unit for 28 days before I rescreened their brains. And half of them left. In all of our studies, everyone is a volunteer, and they can leave anytime they want. Why did they leave? Because they were going through cannabis withdrawal, which is a real unhappy place to be. It doesn't kill you like alcohol or benzodiazepine withdrawal could do, but you're unhappy. You can't sleep. You're irritable. You don't think appropriately. You're just absolutely miserable. So half of them went home. And I thought, oh boy, I've lost so many, I won't be able to see the change over 28 days. With only half the people, we were able to show if you stay off cannabis for 1 month, that you can significantly increase the brain receptors again. You can go back toward your normal state of performance. So these data were very important, and these are the same people that I did the measurement of the THC in their blood for up to 30 days. And then I said, oh boy, well, if we have THC in the brain for that long, and if we've seen this downregulation and then back regulation, upregulation, what does it mean for psychomotor performance, right? Because it's active THC that's in the brain, not the metabolite. Okay, so we were really lucky because there's a guy that I'm very jealous of. He's at the University of Maastricht. He's a good friend and colleague, Jan Ramakers, and in the Netherlands, he can do something I can't, okay? So he does studies like I do under very controlled conditions where he doses cannabis and looks at the effects. But what he can do is he doses cannabis, he puts them in cars and puts them out on the regular roads. Nobody's going to let me do that here ever. I've actually driven in it. It's a very instrumented car. There's like a driver's ed instructor in the car with dual controls. And so what he's able to do, though, is some of the tasks that we use in the laboratory. Many times people will say, well, that's not really like driving. Well, he's able to show what happens in the lab, and then he puts them on the road, and he's able to show that with these two tasks that were developed, critical tracking and divided attention, that they can predict poor driving on the road. And so we brought over all the equipment, and we brought over all of a graduate student, and we used these tests in that same study where we measured the THC in the blood and we measured the regulation of the receptors. And what was shocking to us, if you look here, this is how controls perform on trickle. Are you telling me I got to quit? All right, okay. Ignore him, okay? So here's the control, and you see that at baseline, the day after they come in, they have a significantly poorer performance in critical tracking. And what shocked us, 3 weeks it remained. So while they have that THC in the brain, it still is affecting their performance. And if you looked at control losses, divided attention, control losses, what you see again, here's the controls with very few losses. Here they are at baseline, the morning after, and even though they have improvement, they still have significant impairment after that time. Now, I gotta speed up a little bit. So the first thing I want you to look at, this is blood THC, this is time, and there's frequent smokers up here and occasional smokers in blue. This is the problem. We have two populations. We have occasional users and we have chronic frequent smokers. So if you look at the THC, all of our chronic smokers come into my unit and they're all positive because they have this amount of THC that's still in their body and measurable. And then I dose them and they all stay positive for about 24 hours and then they start to decrease. And this is at a cutoff of 1 microgram per liter. The occasional people are negative. We dose them. Notice how short a time they're all positive, very, very short time. And by 7 hours, they're all negative. If you go to a limit of 5 micrograms per liter, which Washington State is using, and which Colorado has a permissive inference to use, there's a difference. The first thing you want to see is now about 75% of the chronic users come in positive, and this is overnight while they're sleeping. We dose them the next morning, but look how quickly they drop now. They're not up here, they're down here, but almost 16% are going to be positive for a very long period of time, okay? And here's the worst part. Here's our occasional guys. They're not even going to get up to everybody over 5 by 30 minutes, and they're all going to be negative by 2.5 hours, and they're going to be impaired more like 6 to 8 hours. Okay, he's looking serious now. All right, so what we're trying to do is find some markers of recent cannabis use. And lucky, we find out that these other markers work the same in both occasional users and chronic users. And you can see here, I didn't even put carboxy-THC on because everybody's positive, but these were the first data that showed us that if we looked at CBD, CBN, and THC glucuronide, that they're only going to be positive for a very short period of time in both occasional and chronic users. The problem is that they're not going to be positive in everyone. So I dose you, I know you've had it, but you don't end up with any. So they're inclusionary. If you find them, it means recent use. If you don't find them, it doesn't. If you look at our last study, I gotta look at the time. Ooh. Okay, so if you look at our last study, this is smoked cannabis, this is vaporized cannabis, this is oral or edible cannabis, and this is THC. You'll see after a period of time, the edible cannabis increases, okay, over time. And these markers, we looked for new markers. So we have tetrahydrocannabivarin, okay, cannabidiol, cannabigerol, and cannabinol. And if we look at what this means, measuring THCV carboxy, not useful at all. It's around too long. Tetrahydrocannabivarin and THC glucuronide are great, but they have low detectability. And our best results were for cannabigerol, cannabinol, and you'll see the question mark by cannabidiol. So these are natural constituents in cannabis. I have to take cannabidiol off because we tested preparations that have low CBD, and we all know that there are many preparations now with high CBD. Okay, just tell him to go away. All right, so I'm going to show you, this is important quickly. People talk about tolerance. Well, these guys that are the chronic frequent smokers, they are tolerant to everything about cannabis. That is absolutely not true. Here's the way to think about tolerance. I've got two good slides. So here is your chronic user, here is your occasional user. When they're sober, the occasional user is going to perform better than the chronic frequent smoker, okay? Because they have that THC in the brain. But then when you dose, you're going to have a steeper slope here in the occasional user than the cannabis user. So the chronic cannabis user will be impaired and show impairment, but it's going to be a shallower curve, not as steep. So that's the best way to think about it. And if we go here, this is, I think, lovely. Here's my occasional cannabis users, and here's my chronic frequent cannabis users. And so my occasional cannabis users at a low THC concentration are going to be very high. They're self-reporting how high they are. My chronic frequent smokers have to go to much higher levels of THC, and they don't even reach the same level of high. Okay, so really good example of that. Now, I'm going to absolutely skip all my in utero stuff just to show you this is tobacco's effects on smoking. We were very lucky that we had enough women who used both nicotine and cannabis. That's not lucky, that's bad. But we were able to show significant effects of cannabis on birth weight, head circumference, and birth length, independent of tobacco. And there are two beautiful long-term studies, one from Canada in middle-class, low-risk women, and one in high-risk minority women, and they both are showing the same things. No effects at birth, and not till 4 years of age. At 4 years of age, the children who are exposed in utero to cannabis are showing behavioral problems and performing worse on cognitive tests. By 11, they have significantly smaller head circumferences, which is a mark of brain size, and they have increased cannabis use and drug use. But you have to remember, they were raised in a family that felt it was acceptable to use drugs during pregnancy. So that's a very complex thing. Okay, here's the high-risk group. They're showing decreased verbal reasoning, worse academic performance, and increased use. And I'm sure that Dr. Madras will cover this study, so I'm going to skip it. And I'm going to go to, come on. Okay, public misconceptions about cannabis, okay? Number one, it's not addictive. Absolutely it's addictive, okay? We have, unfortunately, too much evidence of this with the increase in treatment admissions. That it doesn't affect cognitive or psychomotor performance. Hopefully I've shown you that. That it doesn't, in pregnancy, that it doesn't hurt the fetus or developing child. Do you realize in Colorado, some obstetricians are telling pregnant women to use cannabis to reduce nausea and vomiting? That is frightening, absolutely frightening. Cannabis must be safe if it's medicine, and cannabidiol is proven to reduce seizures. Those tests are underway now. We are getting the evidence that we need, but people think because Sanjay Gupta put it on CNN that it's proven. It hasn't been proven, it's now being done, and that there's tolerance to all cannabis effects. And because I'm leaving and he can't hurt me later, I'm just going to go to this, okay? So if we look how things were in the 1970s, you can see here that we had a lot lower potency of cannabis, we had imprisonment for possession, we had greater perceived risk of use, especially in adolescents. We didn't know much at all about the acute and chronic effects, and we didn't have much research at all on the potential therapeutic effects. This is where I think I'm afraid we are now in 2016. We have increased availability and intake of both with medicalization and legalization. We have increased motor vehicle crashes and fatalities. We have increased potency and new administration routes, which was just touched on, about the major issue with butane extracted waxes and dabs. We have a very poor infrastructure for controlling the potency and the composition and contaminants, and we are starting to realize that cannabinoids may have some good therapeutic effects. Where do we need to be? We need to be where we have well-controlled research on the safety and efficacy of cannabinoids. We need to produce plant medications that have stable composition and potency, and I know Alice Mead's going to talk to you about that later. We have to have effective administration routes that are not based on smoking and that delivering such toxic compounds. We need to improve medication access for legitimate patients, and number one, we have to keep it out of the hands of adolescents and young people. And I heard that the age of 25 for the final development of the brain. We talk about late 20s, the brain is still developing, and we have to remove the barriers and expand cannabinoid research to understand all of its effects, which are many. And the last thing is we need to develop either biological markers of recent use or behavioral markers of driving impairment that can be done at the roadside. We have to have scientific, evidence-based drug policy and legislation. We need to improve, like we're doing today, that the public gets this information, and we need to do a lot more research. Thank you so much.
Coming back from break right about now. That's okay. We'll make up the time. Dr. Huestis traveled a great distance. She actually had a very difficult time getting here yesterday, having her plane significantly delayed in Minneapolis. So I definitely wanted, and conference organizers wanted you folks to hear her research and her information, and I'm glad she was able to get to it. Some of the slides that she had to kind of go through quickly, some of that data is going to be repeated again from other presenters during the course of the conference. So you'll hear it a second time as well. So thank you very much. We're going to take a break now, and we're going to come back at 10:35, which is right now. So let's take a 10-minute break and come back at about 10:45, and we'll hear from our next speaker. Thank you.